My name's Stuart Robertson. I'm a partner at L.E.K Consulting, a global strategy consulting firm of about 2,000 professionals around the world. And one of my job titles is Disruptive Analytics Lead, which means I have responsibility for helping L.E.K itself, but also primarily our clients, navigate disruptive trends in analysis. That originally started 8-9 years ago with our focus on ML and AI. But for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been increasingly both fielding questions from our clients and doing further research on quantum computing and its effect. And I think I'd characterize the questions we're asked as maybe twofold. One is, what should we do about quantum? And the second is a question of how do we best invest to be exposed to the benefits quantum computing might bring. And so from particularly capital providers, private equity groups, and so forth, interested to know where in the value chain or within their own portfolio companies they should put capital to best take advantage of the opportunity quantum computing provides.
And Stuart, what factors do you help clients consider in evaluating whether to address quantum computing, whether that question is an urgent challenge for the client or not?
Yeah, I think that is in some ways the core of every question we address. And one of the ways we've tried to think about it is by characterizing organizations as to whether they are pioneers in quantum computing, early adopters, mature adopters, or bystanders, so to speak. And it's relatively easy to know if you are a pioneer or a bystander. You'll be a bystander if there's limited analytical application in your business today, and quantum computing is unlikely to change that. Likewise, if you're already pioneering technologies or deep within development of quantum computing, then you will probably be aware of that. So the subtlety comes between distinguishing, for those businesses where there is a significant analytical element to it, should you be an early adopter or a late adopter? And I think, Sam, in fact, your introductory keynote, which for those who missed is well worth checking out later if you have the opportunity, summarized it perfectly for the early adopters, which is if your business has at its heart a core requirement for a significant analytical process in simulation, optimization in particular, then you are likely to want to be an early adopter. And at the moment, certainly based on the experience with people we speak with, you're unlikely to see an advantage from that tomorrow. I don't know, Mohammed can probably confirm as a practitioner directly that that's the case. But being able to invest ahead of time to build that understanding such that when opportunities do arise, for those businesses, that will be a considerable competitive advantage. If you're not in that camp, we genuinely advise, don't worry about it quite yet. There's enough uncertainty in the technology stack and the best practices that if this isn't going to be a core area of competitive advantage for you, you're better off watching what people like Mohammed are doing, learning from that, and when the technology becomes more mature and more capable of sustaining your processes, that's the moment you switch. Otherwise, you'll be investing where you don't have an obvious advantage from being a first mover.
And Stuart, very similar question. How would you characterize the stage of quantum computing adoption of your clients? I'll leave it there. Are they all still experimenting, essentially?
Yeah, I think that would be fair. I think our clients and people who approach us with these questions can be maybe split into three. There are those who are participating in the value chain of quantum computing, yes. So they're maybe providing software or refrigeration or other cryogenic techniques or so forth. They have a different set of questions about the future of the technology to some extent because they're relying on its growth to fund their business activities. For those trying to use quantum computing to improve their technologies, I think experimenting would be best, or indeed, I'd almost say in the majority of instances, thinking about whether they should be experimenting. And I think that's right where we are in this process. There's a lot of excitement. I'm a huge believer in the potential for this technology. Again, Sam, earlier you touched on the fact that the potential of this technology is in some ways unproven, and there are a minority but important dissenting voices as to what that opportunity may be like. I'm not one of those dissenters, but I'm also realistic that the technology is not, as of today, delivering the promise that it has in the future. So, yeah, I think everyone is experimenting at this point in time, based on what I've experienced.
Stuart, I'll stick with you for a second. Mr. Mahajan from Fujitsu was talking about the simulation work that Fujitsu is doing. How can adopters best use simulation of quantum computing to practice and prepare themselves for quantum computing?
I think we're big believers that simulation is the best first step for the majority of organizations getting started on a quantum computing journey. The availability of hardware is limited, and that which is available tends to be annealing, which is very important for optimization, and there's a lot of benefit there. But most organizations don't want to put that level of investment into hardware at this stage. That may vary, and indeed Mohammed's organization is one who could choose to do so if it so wished, more simply than others. For those earlier in that journey, experimentation through simulation, I think, has a number of benefits. It's cheaper, it's more readily available, and realistically, in the development of skills, and I saw the handout on the table from the research that Omdia were just doing earlier this year, saying how upskilling people was one of the biggest challenges. And at the moment, what we observe is a lot of organizations are effectively taking people, to some extent with a similar background like myself, in more ML and artificial intelligence, and trying to move them over to quantum computing expertise more than they're able to hire people who qualified through a quantum computing route. And for those people, that is an easier transition into taking those coding skills. You know, there are ways to access simulators with common ML techniques like Python or other scripting languages, and that gives people an ability to start to educate themselves, start to transition that team into learning what may or may not work, and focus on areas where there could be benefits. And as the hardware catches up, that means for those organizations, they're in a much better position to take advantage of it, even if they haven't had the immediate need to invest up front.
And Stuart, how should adopters think about the different quantum computing hardware options, and what might be best for their specific needs and goals? How should they try to future-proof their operations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I'm sure many people in this room, I'd be amazed if anyone in this room could, hand on heart, say they know which quantum computing hardware technology is going to be the best. I mean, you know, at the moment, the most developed, I suppose, are superconducting technologies, which IBM and Google and so forth have worked, but they are very noisy, even if they scale, and there are engineering challenges in that scaling. Ion traps are perhaps less noisy, but reaching scale at that is currently far from proven. And you know, even more emergent technologies. I noted in this country, the Ministry of Defense just signed an agreement with Orca for their photonic technologies, which are coming out as well. No one knows exactly which of those will work, in my view, and what their uses might be. It's funny, I've seen a lot of people describe it as, is this equivalent to the VHS versus Betamax challenge? And it's, I can't remember, I think a journalist described it's more fundamental than that. It's more like, should you use valves or switches if you were designing a computer in the 1930s? Or an analogy I've used before, it's more like the Wright brothers trying to decide should they use rotor blades or wings for the first aircraft. And in the same way, if we take that analogy, that a helicopter has different uses and an aircraft has different, a plane has different uses, I suspect, at least in the near term, that's what the hardware is going to look like. We may well find a scaled version of ion traps, maybe using a broader electric field, could be used for smaller scale computation where noise is the enemy, but scale isn't of great benefit. By contrast, superconducting, which I think is where most of the money has been put and where most people are investing at the moment, certainly for big, full-scale opportunities, I think is likely to be the right ones. And then, of course, we all have the annealing technologies, which we were just hearing about. It is much more commercialized. So if I could just take 1 second more, actually, on the other part of your question, which is how do you future-proof against it? Again, I think for most organizations that I've spoken with, they're future-proofing by not committing. They're practicing in simulation, they're practicing in investigating where a good opportunity for quantum computing might sit in their core business. And I think that is the right for the majority of organizations, but I slightly fear it does mean people are spreading their bets. And part of me wonders that for those companies where the advantage of quantum computing is so large to justify more specific investment, and the nature of the problem they want to solve can guide them more to a less noisy solution or a higher scaling solution. I think for those organizations, that is a minority of them, but some are represented here, greater commitment to hardware is probably worthwhile in order to accelerate that development, because the hardware developers themselves are not going to solve your business problem. That's not what they're worried about. And the ability to cooperate and partner on specific technological issues where you think that technology is most likely to give advantage, I think for those organizations where the advantage is big enough and the pocket's deep enough, a higher degree of specificity might be to their benefit.
Stuart, what types of quantum computing vendors do your clients tend to use? Are there particular vendors that are commonly used? Do your clients tend to focus on one vendor, or do they tend to rather more work with several vendors?
Yeah, I think for 99% of people we speak with, they are, to the extent they're using a quantum computer directly at all rather than a simulator, are renting it, and traditionally renting it from IBM or D-Wave to use those opportunities. I think the other aspects in terms of vendors, my perception is there's a matching problem at the moment, if I could put it that way. The number of startups in the space and the distribution of expertise is growing every day. But it's not easy for organizations to find that or know who they're looking for. And likewise, I'm not sure the startups quite know which problems they are solving. So if I'm honest, most vendor relationships I'm observing are kind of happening a bit by accident. I think there's often a case that someone wants to find something and they manage to connect, maybe at an event like this. Maybe someone proactively reached out and it happened to work. But I do think there's a matching problem, a translation issue in the industry at the moment of trying to get vendors, particularly small vendors, which is a lot of the ecosystem at the moment, to have access to the companies that could use it, and vice versa.
Stuart, shifting gears a little bit, what typically works well for clients in educating themselves about quantum computing and building specific technical skills for their staff?
Yeah, and if I could extend that question, if I may,
yeah.
There is a question beyond the technical skills, how you embed, relatively expensive R&D projects in an organization, particularly when the technology isn't the easiest to explain. And I think for that reason, there are two parts to the education, as I say. One is the technical side, which, as I say, most experience we've encountered is largely trying to transition existing business intelligence or machine learning teams. A portion of those people start to get to grips with quantum computing, maybe supported by some external hires who have maybe come from an academic background as practitioners. And that approach seems quite sensible, at least to us at the moment, in terms of building up that technical capability. If you're not actually needing to build a quantum computer, then you don't need a giant team of physicists to maintain it. But the bit I think we're seeing the biggest challenge on is when organizations can set that up and there's a bit of a roadmap to do it, then you have the problem that you're incubating a highly technical R&D project with a uncertain and quite long-term payback period that needs to be explained to senior executives and decision makers as to why they're doing that. And that is the place where, and almost that executive education almost, I think is where it's easy to fall down, because if your technical team are busy trying to explain what you're doing in terms of collapse of the wave function, then it is very unlikely your investment committee is going to be particularly thrilled at the opportunity to put more money after it. So yeah, I would say there is a responsibility there, whether that can be done internally or whether that requires external practitioners or communication specialists to help translate that gap. But I don't think organizations should underinvest in bridging that divide. Otherwise, you can quite easily have a siloed, potentially technically very successful, but in terms of the impact it has on the organization, it never gets anywhere.
We have a little over 11 minutes left. I want to take a pause and just check if there's questions from the audience that we can address.
Hi, Peter Rogers of Tato. I advise companies on quantum adoption, and there's a lot of discussion about advantage, and obviously that's the exciting part of quantum. But if you look at it from a SWOT kind of analysis, there's four things you've got to think about. And the advantage is obviously the gold at the end of the rainbow. But today we're anticipating the gold. That's maybe 3, 5, 10 years away. But there's immediately the millennium bug type of problem of there's a threat, which is in 10 years, all our data could be in the clear if quantum happens. So we need to be thinking about our architectures fundamentally from what happens in a quantum world. We need to be anticipating that now. And I think that if you think about the SWOT, you've got the threat, which is, suddenly everything is in the clear. The weakness is talent is in very, very scarce supply. So how do I anticipate that gap of talent? How do I deal with that? How do I get to the advantage? And I think the strength ultimately all enterprises are looking for is like quantum coherence. How do we integrate quantum into our systems in a coherent way that complements our existing systems? So I guess the questions for you guys is, we've heard about advantage, but what about threat? What about weaknesses? And how do we get to a coherent state in the end game?
I'm happy to take a stab at that. No, I think I wholeheartedly agree, particularly on the weakness side, that there is a lack of availability of talent. And I think there is, to some extent, these things can grow exponentially as emerging successes arise. And I think that does put a burden of proof on people. I can imagine having these same conversations in 5 years' time will be feeling somewhat depressing, even if the technology has advanced, and that can cause ebbs and flows in the investment cycle, which not only will starve people of capital, but it also starve them of talent. On the threat side, I think you're right to highlight cryptography as a clear example when it gets there, and it feels to me an example of what I sometimes call a who pays problem, which is everyone knows there's a issue or a benefit. Everyone knows they ought to invest, but nobody wants to be the person that invests first, because if you crack it, you benefit everyone, but you can't necessarily monetize that all for yourselves. And I think in those situations, realistically, that requires public sector cooperation internationally to help lubricate the organization's approach to it. But at the moment, if I'm being candid, I think we're underfunded on that thread.
Hi, it's L.E.K from DHL. So I guess I'm wondering, is there any solid examples where you can point to and say, this technology has had a benefit here, and maybe the answer is no, because there's no quantum advantage proven as yet. But then, if you wanted to sort of get the interest, is it maybe to highlight there's potential threats coming? What would be the sort of solid, the sort of elevator speech you would give to a company that might be considering moving in, looking into this technology?
Well, I think for a logistics provider, I'd probably say, you will know better than I, but I would take a punt at, for every second you can save on delivery, that's worth a few £million in your profitability. Quantum algorithms give a promise of maybe not an exponential speed up, but certainly a quadratic speed up or similar to logistical optimization problems. And as a result, the benefit that organizations like DHL could receive from this is gargantuan, even if it's a few years away. And DHL would not wish to be left behind by anyone who has managed to invest, maybe at relatively moderate cost up front, to be able to address that. In the near term, I think areas like annealing do give a gateway for that kind of optimization style planning. And I know it's a shame Safraz, the other panelist, wasn't able to make it at Johnson & Johnson, but I remember in our pre-meeting he was discussing how one of the areas they were most interested in was logistics for vaccine rollout, because they recognized that their ability to do that in a more cost-effective way is hugely beneficial. So my pitch would be don't get left behind by that, because the prize is large enough and the technology is mature enough to start learning now rather than just hoping for its anticipation in the future.
Hi, Faisal Kamran from Sony. I wholeheartedly agree with the gentleman over there in the front. My apologies, I missed your name again. There's a lot of funding, as was talked about earlier today from the State Secretary too, which is available on the quantum computing. And you talked about this point of being underfunded. There are a lot of problems which are not being addressed, while there is a lot of investment into the new technologies and the opportunities. Just looking at the technological fronts, you go from superconducting computing to quantum diamond vacancies, neural networks. You talk about silicon-based quantum computing, atom-based. And this plethora of these new technologies which are coming out without having proof of concept, it demands a lot of resources. If you just keep up coming with the new ideas only, without having investments into proofing something which already exists or not, how do you consolidate these fundings into more sustainable routes to have a much more effective future technology then?
Gosh, yes, I wish there was an easy answer to to that. I think the proliferation of technology is in some ways an inevitable period in any R&D-like situation. The strange thing here is that R&D is being done at a global scale by a number of organizations. I think my view from where we are maturity-wise is that is right, but over time, technologies will start to prove differentiation between themselves, and that will help stop the kind of Ponzi scheme of ambition that I fear we can create, whereby the more immature your technology is, your ability to promise more goes up. I'm hopeful that as real examples appear, that is where the money will actually flow, because people will have use cases for that, and that will differentiate. But I wholeheartedly agree with your point. At the moment, the options are far wider than I think the final outcomes will be, at least personally.
Well, we've come to the end of our scheduled time. I guess I would ask if, Mohammed and Stuart, if you want to provide your final last piece of most important advice to potential adopters, if you want to take a few minutes for that.
I think my answer would be, first and foremost, think very carefully, do you need to invest in quantum computing now? If you can afford to wait because your business activities allow it, then, to the gentleman from Sony's point, there's a lot of ways to lose money in this currently, and you don't need to take that risk if the benefit to you isn't so much. If it does need to be now, and there are a number of organizations for which that is true, then I would back up everything Mohammed just said, that think about the problem, think about the people you need, and think about setting your organization up, whether that's executive education or similarly, so that it can be not just a technical success, but a business-wide one.